Hundreds of videos not released, early access. Join the Patreon. MythVision. My really good friend Anthony Guthrie, he helped made this possible with a substantial donation, and thank you, my friend. Here are his questions. What do we know about the historical practice of slavery in the first century, especially the inheritance of foreign slaves who could be beaten to an extent without recourse? And I want to follow through with all that he has to say on this, because you'll get the tone of what he's trying to ask. Yahweh, the author of the Epistle of James, and Jesus in the Gospels all seem to intend for the old laws to be upheld forever, including those regarding slavery. When Jesus states in Matthew 5 that he came to fulfill the law and the prophets, how was this used to justify the transatlantic slave trade? And does it seem that the character of Jesus ever really envisioned a world without slavery? So he has, just like some of the guys I've been interviewing, the scholars, they point out that what slavery was actual slavery. A lot of fundamentalist Christians make it, oh, it's only indentured servitude, and they don't realize the cruelty in the Hebrew Bible or even in the ancient Near East. Was Jesus upholding the same concepts of slavery? First question, I guess.
It's a complicated question. It turns out not to be an easy one. And one of the reasons it's complicated is because slavery was a major institution throughout antiquity that virtually nobody questioned per se. It wasn't seen as an ethical issue throughout in the Roman Empire. The other reason it's complicated is because it wasn't like American slavery. American slavery had everything to do with race, and ancient slavery had nothing to do with race. And it's true that foreign slaves could be beaten without penalty, but any slave could be beaten without penalty. A slave was the property of their owner. These were not indentured servants. The word in Greek for slave that gets used in the New Testament is doulos. It's the word that Paul uses of himself, that he's a doulos of Christ. He's the slave of Christ, meaning Christ is his owner, and Christ can do anything he wants with him. Even though that was the case, slavery was a very complicated institution in antiquity because there were slaves on numerous levels. You had some slaves who were sent to the salt mines. Their life expectancy would be about 2 years or something. It was very bad, very bad, very bad. But there were other slaves who were welcome members of upper elite households who were highly educated scholars or highly educated businessmen and businesswomen, and who were well placed and well treated and well dressed and well fed. And so it's not like there was a thing, slavery. There's this wide range of things. But it always involved somebody belonging to someone else, not as an indentured servant, but actually being being owned by them for whatever purpose they wanted to use them for. A large percentage of the population, I forget what the numbers are, but like a third of the population in Rome were slaves. It wasn't based on race. A lot of people, there were various ways to become enslaved. If you were born into slavery, you yourself were, in other words, your parents were both slaves and you were born as a slave. A lot of slaves were provided by wars. And so prisoners of war would typically be made slaves. You could be sold into slavery if you owed debt you weren't able to pay. You could be you were your own collateral. You could become a slave. So there are all sorts of ways to becoming slaves. But again, it wasn't based on race, or it was based on factors like that, the ones I've just mentioned.
And I guess that, sorry.
I was just going to say, Jesus did not oppose the institution of slavery. Either did Paul. Jesus, but that shouldn't seem weird. Nobody opposed the institution of slavery. I mean, we have authors who are slaves. They don't oppose the institution of slavery. It's just the way things are. It's just, and so I don't know that it occurred to much of anybody. I mean, slaves didn't want to be enslaved, and slaves could be set free, of course. I mean, an owner could set free somebody that they thought well of, or that they appreciated, or that they were paid off, or and so it was a fluid institution, but it definitely was slavery, and there were some nasty things that happened. It was also, though, it turns out. Sorry, but it turns out that in many ways, in the ancient world, in many times and places, it was better to be a slave than to be a poor free person. Because the slave, at least, the master has a reason for feeding the slave to make sure that they're fed enough and healthy, because this is their hired labor. And if the person dies, they've lost an asset. The impoverished person doesn't have any backup plan. And so they're often seen as worse off than slaves.
Interesting. I guess the final thing I'd like to say is, was this whole Matthew 5 with Jesus to fulfill the law and the prophets, was this just like a used verse or passage to justify transatlantic slave trade? I mean, we know that like the Southern slave owners in America, for example, would use Bible verses sometimes to like, use their, slavery's thumbs up,
I don't know about Matthew 5 during the slave trade. It'd be worth finding out. But Matthew 5 itself is a complicated passage. It's not so. But you're not asking what it really means. You're asking how was it used.
Right,
and
right.
I don't know how it was used during the slave trade. It doesn't ring a bell as being the most common thing, though, because you have other things that would be more appropriate. The one that was used a lot, for example, was the curse of Ham. In the Old Testament, where in the story of Noah's three sons, who one of whom, Ham, saw Noah naked when he was stone drunk, and Noah realized that he'd been shamed in front of his son, and he cursed his son Canaan. And in the 19th century, as they developed race theories, anthropologists developed race theories that you have these races, and some have some qualities, some have other. The thought came to be that the what they called at the time the Negroid race came from Ham, and that since that race was cursed, that meant that white folk were justified in enslaving black folk. And so that was a very common thing. But Matthew 5, I'm not aware of, but it just might be my ignorance.
Well, thank you, Anthony, for those questions so much.